for and towards interreligious understanding. I'm joined tonight by three speakers, one Jew, one Christian, and one Muslim, from three regions of the world, the UK, Holland, and the US. None of them live either in Israel or Palestine right now, but we know that each one of them is concerned both with what transpires here, as well as with the fabric of relations in their local communities. I'm also joined by my colleague at the Rossing Center and my neighbor, whom you've met, John Munayer. John is a Palestinian and I am an Israeli Jew. We will be co-facilitating this program as we feel that this is usually the best model. I must emphasize that we have not gathered to debate the conflict itself. Our purpose is to discuss dialogue and relations in the shadow of the conflict. We are confident that our panelists will strive to maintain this focus. Should you pose a question, please remember these guidelines. Let me now present our three speakers briefly and allow each of them to introduce her or himself. Ethan Felsen has worked in interfaith relations for more than 30 years with local and US national Jewish bodies. He is currently the executive director of an NGO called A Wider Bridge. Dr. Jane Clements is an Anglican Christian and has extensive background in interfaith work and education in the UK. Jane is the founder of the Interreligious Forum for Discussion of Israel and Palestine. And lastly, Alina Jabari has much experience in Muslim-Jewish dialogue in Holland and is involved in community organizing for Muslims in the city of Amsterdam. I'd like to ask each of you to more fully introduce yourselves and tell us a bit about your work. Ethan, may we begin with you? You're muted.
Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity to be together on a very, very difficult day and a very difficult week and time, a day when too many people are living in fear, especially children. I do think it's important that we be together. And I pray for a day when Israelis and Palestinians can live out their national destinies in peace. And that is part of why we are here, because there's much that faith groups and faith communities can bring to this issue. My interfaith journey started in 1988 in Hartford, Connecticut. I was the director of the Jewish Community Relations Council, and I'd helped to start an interfaith coalition. There wasn't one in town. It had fallen apart after the Yom Kippur War and a disagreement between the rabbis and the ministers in town. And we started one in the late 80s and spent many, many hundreds of hours. We did many, many interfaith programs. We got to know each other very, very well, but we left Israel and Palestine for another day. 1998, Israel 50 is coming up, and the Hartford Courant is doing a supplement. And the president of the Hartford Seminary was somebody I'd known very well, and the reporter was somebody I knew very well. And the reporter said, "Do you have anybody you can recommend?" I said, "Yes, there's a Palestinian professor at this seminary and the seminary president. And we spent many hours together. And these are two people that I think should help write articles in the supplement that the Hartford Courant is going to do for Israel 50. And it came out, and the Palestinian professor wrote a very, very fair and complex piece. The seminary president, whom we knew very well, wrote, "The future requires repentance." And she said that Jews need to let go of the idea that a Jewish state in a physical place is crucial to Jewish identity. And so she was prescribing that Jews need to let go of Israel, let go of Zionism as core to identity. And what that said to me in prescribing that another faith group should let go of something that for most is a cardinal tenet of faith, that there was something very, very broken. And I got very involved in, even more involved in interfaith relations. I was on the national stage when the Durban conference happened, and we had professionals who were there who were really in kind of shock at what was happening. They were seeing civil rights groups standing with the Jewish community on complex matters related to whether or not anti-Semitism would be included as a form of xenophobia, or Zionism would be considered racism, and the church groups that they had worked with on so many issues moving in another direction. And so I got even more involved in studying what was going on. And then when the Presbyterian Church took their stance toward divestment in 2004, I became the person who went to all of the church conventions, the Presbyterian and Methodist conventions since 2004, trying to engage in dialogue, deepen understanding, get people engaged on the local level to work through these very, very complex issues.
Thank you, Ethan. Okay, and Jane, please. You're muted.
How terrible to hear those words, you're muted. Well, it's good evening from the UK to everybody. And I must apologise for the light changing. We've got really strange weather here at the moment, and it's one moment it's blazing sun, the next minute it's a rainstorm. So I hope it's not going to put you off too much. My own background is in, as Ophira has said, is in interfaith relations. Ophira and I have worked together for more years than I'm going to mention now, but there's quite a few of them. In that I've been able to bring interfaith groups to the Holy Land, Israel-Palestine, and to study. I worked in Jewish-Christian relations predominantly, although my specialism as a theologian was Islam. But I found that the one issue that derailed all interfaith relations in the UK was the whole question of Israel. And there'd be so many occasions when this would happen, but everything would be fine, people would be talking quite happily, and then somebody would say something and the whole thing would go kaboom. And needed to be a safe space, so I set up FODIP, the Forum for Discussion of Israel and Palestine. And one of the sparks that really started this was that we had some speakers came before I set up FODIP to London from the Bereaved Families Forum, which I'm sure many of you will be very familiar with. And as they were planned to speak in the Houses of Parliament to the House of Lords, our senior chamber, and they were given a list as they were going in. And one side of the list was those people they were going to speak to who were pro-Israel. And on the other side of the list, there were those people who were going to be in the audience who were pro-Palestinian. And for these speakers, it was just a wake-up call that the conflict had been imported into the UK. And that's what we see. We've been incredibly busy this week. It's been all over the news. It was the first item on BBC News for much of this week, even knocking COVID off. We're still way into that. And lots of schools, colleges, universities, local authorities have been in contact with us saying, how can we address this issue? So I'm really glad to be here this evening. To be able to share with you and perhaps to learn quite a lot as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jane. And Alina?
Yes, thank you so much. I hope everyone hears me well. Yeah. Good evening from Amsterdam. Again, thank you for inviting me here today. And I want to thank John specifically, as it is through this trusted connection that I consent to speaking here today. Actually, I want to start off with saying that since receiving the invitation, I have been going back and forth about considering and reconsidering my acceptance. I was told by the organizers that they were happy to have me, a critical voice, present today at the discussion. I asked why they chose to have the critical voice come from the Muslim at the table when we find ourselves in a reality, in a political reality where Muslims' voices or where a Muslim's voice is by default often already perceived as being too critical, too radical, too angry, or too, you name it, until proven otherwise. I asked why they didn't invite a speaker from maybe Jewish Voices for Peace, for example, because right now critique will come from the one whose voice is already not considered credible. Why do I mention this here? I mention this because I speak here today not just as someone with experience in interfaith and interreligious dialogue, but I also speak here, as said, as a Muslim. And it means that my experience cannot be separated from what it means to enter interfaith and interreligious spaces as a Muslim. To make it more explicit, it means that I'm unable to speak about my experience without talking about the power imbalance Muslims are subjected to in these spaces. A power imbalance where your presence might be needed more than wanted, where others define the building, the rooms, the table, and you just get a seat, where your seat legitimizes the space rather than reflecting the wish for your equal participation in the space. So returning to the hesitation and why for the past 2 weeks I have been considering and reconsidering this invitation, speaking to this power imbalance, a power imbalance that is at play even today, this evening. And I have been asking myself what my presence at this panel means, on whose terms, on whose benefit or interest, and at whose cost am I speaking here today? Whose cause am I legitimizing here? Is my presence, my voice here today at the benefit of my own community as well, and at the benefit of the cause I'm trying to advance? And at whose gain comes my time investment? And what will be the consequences of what I wish to share today? So as we're asked to reflect upon our interfaith experience in relation to the Palestinian struggle, I consider it of great importance to connect the power imbalance faced by the Palestinians to the power imbalance faced by Muslims in interfaith spaces. In my participation here today, I therefore choose to reflect on the questions from this specific intersection, while simultaneously ensuring I only speak from the context I can legitimately speak to, which is that of a Dutch Kurdish Muslim living in the Netherlands. Thank you so much. This was my intro for today.
We will be looking forward to hearing from you. John.
So yeah, thank you very much everyone for introducing yourselves and your history in interreligious dialogue. So I would like to start off with the first question, and I think all of you already sort of touched on sort of interreligious work outside of the Holy Land and how it relates in one way or another to the conflict here. So the question is, how does the Palestinian-Israeli conflict affect not only interreligious relations, but also interreligious dialogue in your own context? So we'll start with Jane this time.
Okay, thank you, John. Alina, I'm interested that you assume that you're going to be the only critical voice. I'm perfectly capable of being a critical voice. I'll be a critical voice for whatever is needed. And in fact, that's one of the things that I find myself doing, especially in this situation, is quite often ensuring that all the voices are heard and bringing everybody in, and sometimes having to speak for a particular group that I'm not a member of, but certainly you're not alone in necessarily being critical, and I'm sure I'm not the only person here this evening. It's difficult to address this issue of how the conflict relates on interfaith dialogue without thinking about where we are at the moment. In the UK, I like to think that actually we've got a lot of things right when it comes to interfaith dialogue. We have a lot of spaces. We have equal opportunities. I mean, I don't know if any of my colleagues are on this tonight, but FODIT, for example, is run by Jews, Christians, and Muslims together. It's a lot of our volunteers are Muslim, in fact, but we are three faiths because we find that in the UK there's a perception that the whole situation there in the Holy Land is a religious conflict between Jews and Muslims. And one of the first things we have to do is to explain to people actually there are Christians as well. And this is a constant thing we have to put in. but also it helps having three voices. You know, it's much easier to have a dialogue. I don't like the word trialogue. I don't think that's correct. Between three people than it is between two, especially when you're not sure which way the Christian's going to swing, and sometimes we're not sure which way we're going to swing either. I mentioned earlier that the whole situation of Israel-Palestine derails good interfaith relations quite often. It's the one thing that people can't often bring themselves to address. Even if they've been enjoying really good relations with their neighbours, a large Muslim community, a large Jewish community, living side by side, getting on, talking about festivals, about community issues, and then suddenly something like this comes up on the news and the drawbridges go up and people don't know how to begin to talk to their neighbours. And this is why a good grounding in interfaith dialogue, and one that specifically can deal with these sorts of situations, is really important. I think I'm going to pause there because I think there's probably a lot more that's going to come out as we carry on, specifically, for example, about how we're dealing with the situation at the moment. So I will hand back to you.
Great, thank you, Jane, for elaborating about the complexity of the topic itself, even though it's not in the Holy Land itself. So thank you very much. So we'll move on now to Alina, please.
Yes, thank you. Well, actually, I know I didn't actually maybe clarify that in my bio, but before answering this and the following questions, I think I'd have to point out that actually my experience is a combination of, if I can say, different interfaith setups, meaning for the most part, my experience lies in Muslim-Jewish interfaith dialogue, specifically in an international context. But for the last period, this experience actually included broader religious or interreligious dialogue, in the local Dutch context as well. So in answering these questions, in my reflection will be a combination of these experiences. For the question, I think it's quite a broad one, but in answering, I would like to zoom in on my experience with the last organization I worked for in the local context, where this power imbalance that I hinted on earlier, or hinted to earlier, actually directly influenced the way in which the quote-unquote conflict was allowed to, or given space to influence the dialogue. For example, when it came to the quote-unquote conflict, Jewish organizations were given the space to refuse participation if critical voices on Israel were present in the program, even if they came from within the wider Jewish community themselves. And as such, the critical Jewish voice was refused in the program altogether. But on the other hand, where any other speaker or organization, be it Muslim, be it person of color, be it any other marginalized group, they had to prove their own like moderate or safe position in dialogue before even being accepted in the space. And so even in reverse, you know, a Muslim space and mosque was by default questioned about its inclusivity and safety for an interreligious crowd based on no other hint or reason than the space being a Muslim one. That is to say, without going into, you know, specific or without going into possible historical analysis, the materiality in the Dutch dialogue context is one where Christian and Jews are given the space to define the rules of the game, set the framework of the conversations we will have, and your only option as a Muslim in the case of disagreement is refusing to engage altogether, which consequently comes with being framed as the problem, as being framed as the angry Muslim, the one who's disturbing peaceful gatherings, or an obstacle in peaceful solutions, etc. And so indeed, one of the known consequences for being a Muslim with a critical voice in dialogue spaces is that you end up being disqualified or sidelined altogether. So yeah, this is my reflection on this question.
So thank you for bringing that sort of the imbalance of power that you see within your context when sort of addressing not only interreligious dialogue in general, but specifically the conflict itself. We'll move now to Ethan. Go ahead.
Yeah, so first of all, I want to thank you, Alina, for surfacing your experiences and your truths as it relates to this interfaith encounter and how Israel and Palestine play into that. One thing that I have observed over much time is that one of the challenges that we have is understanding others as they understand themselves. I think that's one of the fundamental rules in interfaith building interfaith dialogue is, or one of the challenges is that we need to be able to engage in deep listening so that we may truly understand the other and not come into interfaith dialogue with an idea that its goal is to change the perception of the other. But as important as any of that is that we create a place where people can be their authentic selves. And one thing that I often see in the interfaith space, particularly as relates to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, is a desire to lift up convenient voices, to lift up inauthentic voices. And I'm not saying that there are people who don't have a right to speak their truths, but I often see people who want to create a table where they find somebody from the Muslim community who's very safe because they wave an Israeli flag, or somebody from the Jewish community who's very safe because they condemn Zionism and condemn Israel. And there is something fundamentally inauthentic to that. It is a silencing technique to say that this safe, this space, I want to make sure that there are Jews who agree with me. And how come there aren't? Because I get to define who the Jews are, or there aren't Muslims who agree with me, and I want to bring in these convenient people from the Muslim community or these convenient people from the Christian community. We have vast communal resources and an ability to represent ourselves. And then the challenge becomes how we create the safe space that enables people to engage in deep listening, that the goal of interfaith dialogue, sometimes it can be to have a lovely program. But in the end of the day, it's not about making friends. In the end of the day, it's about deepening understanding. In the end of the day, it is about understanding the other as they understand themselves. And so by creating convenient arrangements so that we can hear our voice multiplied, we may not be able to, in that, really be in true dialogue. We're just having a conversation with ourselves inside of our own echo chambers.
Thank you, Ethan, and thank you, all three of you. We're certainly getting into the matter. I'm going to ask you now to, for some of you, it'll be continuing in the direction, the door you've already opened to an extent, but to speak specifically, and you can bring examples and case studies of challenges that you've experienced and dealt with in addressing the conflict in interreligious initiatives. And please share with us attempts, successful and failures at addressing the presence, the disturbing presence, the presence of the conflict when your agenda is not the conflict itself, but rather the building of interreligious relationships and the deepening of understanding. And this time, if we may, we'll start with you, Alina.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, again, I'm going to speak from my experience, but also, again, the Dutch Muslim experience with that as well. I mean, one of the first challenges that comes to mind for me is the challenge of money and funding. And who, through their funding gets to say in how the dialogue should take place, which religious institutions and organizations are considered legitimate to enter the space, and which organizations are considered to be, like illegitimate or too critical and or too radical, which speakers may or may not be invited, etc. I think this is one of the challenges that I've seen throughout the different spaces. But another thing I'd like to highlight, or I would like to say that is something that Muslims, but I mean, I think, I don't know, others can speak to this as well, how they experience this, but speaking from the Muslim perspective, what Muslims face specifically is the way in which Muslim solidarity with Palestinians is automatically assumed to be based on religious identity, based on an emotional position, as opposed to the possibility of it being a matter of justice and human rights. Not to mention, as was said earlier, that this framing ignores the presence of Christian Palestinians in Palestine, as well as the way the racialization of Muslims ignores the presence of Christians in the Middle East altogether. Another point I'd actually like to mention is the way in which Muslims in the Netherlands are accused, blamed, and questioned for importing the quote-unquote conflict, while any Dutch politician can voice their univocal support for Israel without being blamed for any of the same. Where our Prime Minister just the other day, Mark Rutte, can write a tweet stating Israel's right to self-defense without being blamed for terrorism and or defending violence. And a double standard in which whatever Muslims in the Netherlands say with regards to supporting the Palestinian struggle raises questions of their loyalty, questions of failed integration, but in the same line, white citizens of this country can speak to their support of Israel and they still simply remain Dutch. So where one citizenship remains conditional and the other unconditional. And again, to me, it speaks to the power imbalance present throughout our institutional and social structures, which I believe all play, a part in the challenges when addressing the conflict. Yeah, that's my comment.
Thank you, Alina. And it's so important that you've discussed the structural issues that affect the dialogue. If you'd like, we can give you another moment if you'd like to address what happens when the participants are sitting in the room and you're having the conversation, having closed the door, and leaving some of those structural elements behind, and then perhaps an inward focused reflection. Don't want to put you on the spot, but if you'd like another minute, please take it.
Sure. Well, I mean, it's an interesting question, and I'm not sure if I agree with, if I can say that the premise of this question, meaning I'm not sure if I agree with the idea that, through closing the doors, we can create a power-free space. I think that, in closing the doors, the structural imbalance or the power differences remain present, even if it means like ensuring through that we've tried to create more of a safe space. That doesn't mean the power is absent from it. So yeah, if in response to your question, I'm not sure if I agree with the premise of this question. I don't think we can get totally rid of power in that way.
Okay, thank you, Alina. Ethan, you're next.
Yeah, I guess I'd love to have the conversation about power, because it seems as if what I'm hearing you say, Alina, and I'd love to learn more, is that the Jewish community is one that is using power to control dialogue. And that's something that I've heard and I've read. I'm challenged by that. And I would love to surface why. There is, I believe, a presumption that Jews, because Israel has a military power, that Jews feel somehow powerful. It's just, in order to, most Jews that I know feel a sense of powerlessness. They look at our history, they look at the complexity of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and they don't feel that there'll be a Jewish state forever. They feel it could go away tomorrow, and there's a certain powerlessness in that. It's one of the things that can come out of interfaith dialogue, is, again, to understand the other as they understand themselves. And sometimes when people are in a position where they feel a sense of threat, they speak in a voice of bravado that comes across as as forcing a power over something. And one of our challenges in interfaith relations, I believe, is to help understand what are the fears of the other, what are the vulnerabilities of the other, what motivates the other, what is the role of your history and your family in the understandings that you bring. And I think what is the role of theology, and power is a fascinating thing to understand in a theological construct. One thing that I've found quite remarkable in looking at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is when I talked about that, the statement of that minister. One of the things that I've come to understand, there is within Judaism, there isn't a thread of pacifism, right? There isn't Christianity. I can't speak to Islam, but it's an elephant in the room, how we understand power, right? Moses didn't travel 40 years to the promised land on a donkey. There isn't a sense in Judaism that if I just lay down my arms, that will advance my own security. That's how we understand ourselves. That's something we can grasp out of deep listening and reflecting, that there are these theological differences that really do inform us. What is just war theory in Christianity, Islam, and Judaism? And how does that help us to understand how we identify with the various parties?
Well, thank you, Ethan, for complicating the matters deeply.
Always.
Jane.
Okay, well, I'm playing with that picture you've given us, Ophir, of getting into the room and shutting the door, even virtually at the moment. And it's difficult for me to divorce where we are at the moment with what we usually do. But I think the sense is the same, in that for Jews and Muslims, and for many Christians, but less so in the UK, the whole situation in Israel-Palestine is incredibly emotive. I mean, it's one of these strange things, maybe, that diaspora communities feel it more viscerally because we're not actually there, and this means, of course, that when we have discussions, when we bring people together to talk specifically about Israel-Palestine, which is what we do, we don't do any interfaith dialogue which isn't at least bringing people together so that eventually, even if not immediately, they're going to talk about this. There is a great deal of emotion involved. It's not a logical thing. And what we have to do is dissuade people from thinking that they can come and just say, well, if Palestinians did this, or if Israel stopped doing that, this is what we have to say. It's no good you saying that. You have to listen. And I noticed in the chat somebody had said that we need to understand the narratives of each other, and this is really, really important. So the most important thing is to understand who the other person is that you're talking to, and where they're coming from, and why they feel as they do. And this is why that one of the things that we do, especially a lot of this at the moment, are listening events where people just have 2 minutes to speak and to say how they're feeling and why they're feeling. And these can be very difficult. We heard only on Sunday from how some in the Jewish community, and some of our young people were saying this on Shabbat here. So there were people driving around in cars in Jewish areas, specifically targeting Jewish areas where they knew a lot of a Jewish population, shouting the most horrendous things, against Israel, but against Jews in particular, saying terrible things. And this was really frightening. On the other hand, on the news, what we're seeing is a vast number of horrific pictures of funerals of children in Gaza and so on, and therefore the emotion is really strong. So to see the other person, to see the humanity in the other person, to understand them as an individual. That's the only way in which we can address this. And I often tell the story of bringing a Muslim guy to Israel, and I don't know whether Afia remembers this, but we were at Kibbutz Levi, which is a religious community up in the Galilee, and the kibbutzniks were doing coffee and cake for visitors, and one of our guys, our Muslim guys from Manchester in the north of England, he really didn't want to go. He didn't particularly want to sit in the house of an Israeli and enjoy his hospitality, but his Muslim friends persuaded him, no, look, this is what you've signed up for, this is what you're coming for. And you know, he discovered that this guy that his house he was in actually had come from Britain in the first place, and he'd come from Manchester. And so suddenly, although it didn't change his opinion of what an Israeli was, he realized that actually this was a person who knew the sort of places that he knew. And then he discovered that this guy had come over to England originally as a child on the Kindertransport to escape from Hitler's Holocaust. And so suddenly he sees that this guy's got a story, he's got a narrative. And he stops becoming an Israeli, an occupier, and he becomes a human being with a story. And that's one of the things, you know, that we have to do. But it's difficult here because we've got students in school who are going around with wristbands on, showing their solidarity with one side or another. You know, it could say Free Palestine, or it could be blue and white with a Star of David or something like that. And how do students, you know, how do you help students to deal with that, and how do you help the teachers? So getting people to listen, to understand the narratives, to see the other person, where they're coming from, even if you don't agree, at least it gives you the picture. I could go on, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jane, for emphasizing the importance of perhaps discussing issues when there's an actual relationship already built there. There's some foundation that discussion can grow from. I would like to also pick up on sort of another comment you made, Jane, about the intensity of the conflict at the moment. And I would like to ask all speakers, from sort of giving the conflict a huge role in interreligious dialogue to completely avoiding it, where should we strive to? And how do we handle interreligious dialogue, and specifically the conflict, when there are such extreme sort of moments, events of violence? So if I could start with Ethan this time.
Well, thank you. It's an excellent question. Avoidance is not a strategy. Avoidance is a failure in this. That's one of the things that that's the reason I share that story in the beginning, is that we had been very involved in interfaith relations, and we didn't, I think, through that really understand where the other was coming from, because we decided to leave this incredibly important thing in terms of how we attach to one of the most important issues in the world today for another day. That avoidance caused us to move in very, very separate tracks. We actually recognize that even within our own associations and organizations, the people who were involved in interfaith relations were quite separate and apart from the people who were looking at the policy discussions. They weren't talking to one another within their own communities, and they weren't talking with one another at these in these interfaith settings, and it created a real brokenness that we haven't, I think, to this day recovered from. So avoidance clearly isn't a strategy. It doesn't mean that Israel and Palestine need to control every single thing that that we do. We can learn each other's holidays. We can study what our rituals are for for love and food and dying, and understand what the similarities are, what the differences are. But if we take that which we read about every day in the news and say we don't have the capacity to deal with this, then we're in a system of failure. What it also means, and I know that my co-panelists can speak to this, is that we need a lot of skill building ourselves in terms of deep listening and reflecting and helping people to hear uncomfortable truths, to recognize that there are multiple truths, that nobody has complete truth that I know of, and how we understand what and I think you kind of referred to this a bit, Jane, what kind of the mental furniture is of the people who are in the room, right? What's the large immovable object that we need to walk around, and at the same time, how can I look over there and say, you know, the ottoman might be better over there. Here's how I understand things, and being able to have trust and integrity within these settings. Very, very important to speak with somebody before you speak about them, to have that pick up the phone relationship, that we try not to surprise one another. Those are the things that cause these dialogues to implode half of the time. So we need to give ourselves the infrastructure to be in deep dialogue over differences, across deep divides, and to recognize that we're in the same community. We'll be in the same community next week and next month, and we will be better, not if we always agree, but if we're in communication, if we have the relationships, if we have the trust, even if not always the agreement.
Thanks for bringing up sort of the importance of skills and sensitivities when addressing this conflict, because like you said, it's sort of trying to balance, not completely avoiding it, but also not letting it dominate completely. Because at the end of the day, these communities are going to live together in the same town, neighborhood, and so on. If we could move to Jane.
Yes, we've always said at FODIP, we've said to people, you know, isn't it better to talk about these things before it happens? This is why, you know, over the last 10 days, we've been bombarded with requests from people saying, how do we talk about this? How do we deal with this? You know, and we've been saying for ages, you know, but having said that, you know, people are in different places in the journey. And if you're dealing with the sort of power imbalances, Alina, that you're talking about, if you're dealing with actually trying to understand who your neighbor is, who your dialogue partners are, then the last thing you want to do is to jeopardize that. So I can understand why people are hesitant about raising the questions. We've had so often people say to us, well, the last thing we want to do is to mention Israel. We don't want to mention it, you know, just keep quiet. And yet, you know, when something like this happens, it's not quite too late, but it's almost too late. It's going to be too late for some people. They're going to be so fired up that they're not going to be able to engage to hear the other. So I can understand the avoidance in your question, John, but really, as you said, Ethan, it's a false avoidance. You can only put it off for so long. And you know, the phrase we've always used is the elephant in the room. You know, you've got to admit that it's there sometimes. And in fact, once that happens, I mean, that's an amazing way in which interfaith relations really gel together. When you've got three faiths actually listening to each other, understanding why this is important to each other, that's a great moment.
I think, you know, like you mentioned, addressing this, perhaps the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, but other issues as well, before they erupt, is a key to sort of handling the situation when it indeed erupts, and the need to discuss controversial matters. So thank you very much, Jane. Now it's Alina, please.
Yes. Actually, if I may, I just want to respond to something of the previous, or what was said from the previous speaker to me, Ethan, yeah. on the question of power, and I just wanted to clarify. I forgot which sentence exactly he said how he understood me, but this is not what I meant. What I meant was, or what I was speaking about, is rather structural power and institutional power, which is speaking rather to something else I mentioned in the introduction. So rather speaking to who gets to, how to say, for example, who is on the board of organizations, where does the money come from, who gets to decide who is hosting certain events, first of all, but also, just practically speaking, in terms of, the fact that the majority of Muslims in Western societies come from migration backgrounds, come from, our people of color are already, like, so to say, outside of the dominance or outside of what is considered the norm within society. So it's these type of powers, if I can say, I was speaking to, rather than the examples that you mentioned, Ethan. So I just wanted to clarify that. Then to the question, thank you, John. I mean, I agree with what has been said, in a sense of, I think there is a, rather a historical and Orientalist frame at place when we want to limit, religious relations and interactions to, what's happening in Israel-Palestine specifically. But, going to the question specifically, at the same time, I find it hard to answer because, well, first of all, if I can say, I do not wish to speak on behalf of Palestinians and talk about how I understand this matter to be discussed. And in that sense, actually, I find myself split in two positions where, on the one hand, for me, when it comes to matters of power and justice, I believe we are rather in need of education instead of dialogue. But on the other hand, as has been said, I also don't believe in avoiding the topic altogether and leave the elephant in the room unaddressed. And actually adding to this, how can we even avoid the topic when our tax money already implicates us? When our tax money already gets us involved through funding the very weapons that are used to steal lives. And so in answering this question, I think we should go back to asking ourselves why we do dialogue in the first place. What is our purpose in this work? If it isn't for striving for a more just society, principles and beliefs that are embodied by all three faith traditions, why then are we even in dialogue to begin with? And as such, I believe the presence of the quote-unquote conflict in these spaces should be one that is part of a broader conversation on power and justice, on where the violence of settler colonialism, apartheid, genocide, ethnic cleansing can be addressed like we address the violence of white supremacy and racism, patriarchy, Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, the violence of border policies and Western imperialism, what refugees and migrants have to face, and in that way, the importance of allyship and more. Okay.
Thank you, Alina. I think we have time for one more structured question, and then we'll maybe be going to the Q&A and allow you and invite you to relate even more to one another. But the way I'd like to formulate the last question, and it builds on all of what's gone so far, is, and I'll pick up from where you've just left us, Alina. When our group of discussants are going to get in the room, whether they shut the door and close the windows or not, I would hope that they will be there, able to, willing to, ready to, and not feel suppressed and unable to address all of the questions that you've just mentioned, and many, many more. And the question I ask all of you is, what strategies can you create? What are your successes, or what are your dreams of what you'd like to do? Because we know that particularly at times like this, an ongoing group can explode. A group that was hoping to convene can postpone. I know that over my years of experience with events far smaller than what's going on this week, We facilitators were always on the phone after this event or the other, and some voices are saying, well, maybe we should skip this week. And the other voice is saying, no, it's because of what's happening this week that we created this framework. And whatever people have to say, they should be able to say it to the people with whom they have some acquaintance. And there's a large scale of people and frameworks and groups and degrees of commitment. When I think of these questions, I think personally to my own experience of my children's education at the binational, bilingual Jewish Arab school in Jerusalem, which 6 years ago was the victim of a firebomb. And my son's first grade classroom was burned down on a Saturday night. There was little question that classes would resume Sunday morning at 8 o'clock because there was an a priori commitment that we are going to commit. A framework had been created. There was acrimony, there were disagreements, there was finger pointing, but there was conversation. Now, that may be an extreme example, but we are in extreme times today as well. And so I'd like to invite each of you to address what scaffolding can we build, what can we erect so that we can move forward at the most difficult of times. I think we're back to beginning with Ethan.
What scaffolding can we build is one of the things that I have understood to be true of conflicts around the world is that there has been significantly more invested in people-to-people programs in North Ireland and other places to create an infrastructure of empathy and relationships and trust and capacity to work through problems than with Israelis and Palestinians. And there is a vast network, and you mentioned Yad B'Yad. There are over 100 programs that bring Israelis and Palestinians together, and there is a movement against those programs. It's not easy. It is not presumed by many people that that these programs should go, but gosh, they're important in bringing young people like your son into relationship with Palestinians. I've worked with a lot of these groups, and one thing I've heard from so many of my Israeli friends and my Palestinian friends is that when they became involved with programs like this, the very first time, they thought when they were in a room with a Palestinian or an Israeli that they had only known in a different context. They'd only known through the news. They'd only known as a soldier at a checkpoint or somebody who blew up cafes. But when they were actually together, they thought the other person was going to kill them. That's how broken it is. And that's how needed it is for programs like Kids for Peace to bring young people together, and Yad B'Yad and Roots that are bringing people who would otherwise really live their entire lives inside of their silos, creating an other of people with whom they share a destiny, with whom they will be sharing a land. And so what we can be doing throughout the world is not just supporting these programs, but also creating this at the local level so that we can encounter one another with dignity, with integrity, and to build empathy. That the future for Israelis and Palestinians, these are people that know significant conflict. We have a choice whether we're going to be agents of conflict, throwing out triggering words, taking maximal positions, backing each other into corners, or trying to find a way to be agents of reconciliation, fully understanding the complexities, the histories, the power dynamics, but building something that Israelis and Palestinians can look forward to a more peaceful future and be in relationship as we can be in relationship.
Thank you, Ethan, for words with a positive valence. Jane.
Yeah, so in terms of scaffolding, and I think, Ethan, you've expressed this already, really. It's not a question of one size fits all. You have to know who you're dealing with, where they are. And so, for example, when we've been approached, as we have been this week, by well-established interfaith groups, in particular, I'll mention one women's group, which is formed and run by Jewish and Muslim women in the UK. It's quite high profile, it's quite extensive, it does a lot of good stuff in terms of things they can do together. They were very hesitant about this. They've put their toe in the water on dialogue on Palestine-Israel before, and left it at that, but now they know. And one of the things they can do is they can, if they're told, look, you're going to hear the pain, and you're going to hear pain, it's going to be painful. You know where these women are coming from. You may not know them personally, but you share a common background in dialogue. It's going to be tough. If you're prepared for that, it will grow you, because you will understand more. It will grow you as a human being. And that happens. Obviously, we don't necessarily put it in those words. But then the thing I think that we always start with when we're starting from a baseline is asking in various ways and with various exercises and activities, depending on who you're dealing with. Know yourself. Who are you? Where have you come from? What is important to you? How did you get your ideas, your information? Who's influenced you in your life? What are your values? And reflecting on that, what is your narrative? Let's use that important word. And once you've reflected on that, then you can start to see how that can be shared with somebody else. And I think also, I want to highlight what you said, Alina, about it's got to be useful for something. Talking for talking's sake is really not good enough. I mean, somebody said to me not long ago, the time for dialogue is past. Well, the time for just talking is past, but the time for actually gaining something positive is important, and which is why understanding is an important thing. But so you can work together for a particular project. You can certainly, those of us in the diaspora, those of us not in any way involved in Israel-Palestine, those of us can say, well, there are things that we can support together. There are programs that we can help and support, and through doing that, you can learn. But again, I think, Alina, you put your finger out. You said education. And this is what, in a sense, dialogue has to do. Dialogue has to be listening. It has to be educating yourself before you can share and educate the other.
Alina, please. Thank you for that, Jane.
Thank you again. Yeah, so with regards to the strategy, I mean, there's multiple things coming to my head, of which first, which seems to be the theme of my talk today, but repeating again the question of power, which I believe one of the strategies should be about ensuring equal power for all those who enter the space of dialogue, and equal freedom of speech to those sitting at the table, to those being invited at the table, as opposed to the asymmetry present in dialogue spaces today. I mean, I mentioned something earlier about, people that are invited to speak, and imbalance there, but I think this imbalance, extends to participants as well. When it comes to, when it comes to the Muslim Jewish conferences I've been present at / have co-organized, where both international context, meaning where both people from all over the world, including Israelis and Palestinians, were participating in the space. It should be mentioned that, in fact, Palestinians do not hold equal access to international dialogue spaces as Israelis do. due to travel restrictions, class differences, apartheid laws, etc. And as such, present and representation of voices that come from even the region into the international dialogue context is through that imbalance as well. Yeah, perhaps if I can say, entering to end on a different note, speaking to my own personal motivation for entering the field of interfaith dialogue, which started with Muslim-Jewish interfaith dialogue specifically, is, which I mentioned earlier, is because of wanting to refuse the ahistorical and Orientalist frame that I believe attempts to limit the relations of Muslims and Jews and any other religious group to that of Israel and Palestine, to that of violent Arabs, to that of violent Arabs versus the only democracy in the Middle East. And I believe that we as Muslims and Jews have centuries of histories that go beyond the past 73 years, whether it be in North Africa or Asia or beyond. And because I believe we should be allies in the struggles we are collectively faced with, because I believe anti-Semitism is our fight, like Muslim hatred, racism, and border violence. And so from my personal perspective, my point of motivation is my belief and commitment in standing for justice. It's about the necessity to uphold justice, as I believe my faith instructs me. And understanding this as one of the most common points among all religions, what other faith traditions instruct their believers to as well. The instruction to repair the world, wish for your neighbor what you wish for yourself, to love God's creation as part of one's love and worship of God, and all live in cosmic harmony. And so I just believe in building interreligious relations that can serve as allyships, that acts as standing, that acts and that allows to stand together in all matters of injustice, be it against poverty and homelessness in our neighborhoods and cities, be it against domestic violence and rape culture, be it against the rising fascism, be it for Black Lives Matter, be it the occupation, bombing, and ethnic cleansing of Kurds by Turkey, be it climate justice and our collective struggle to protect the earth, be it anti-Semitism, or be it the Palestinian struggle. I believe this is what we, as groups or communities from our different interfaith traditions or faith traditions are asked to do, and I think that this is what we should build our strategy around.
Thank you, Alina, for the breadth of vision and for asking some of these difficult questions. Thank you all. I think we have some good questions also from our participants. John, you've collected them.
Yes, just before I ask a question from the audience, I just want to let all the participants know that at the end of this webinar, we will be opening it to everyone. So sort of a social gathering after a conference. So we'll have a virtual sort of social gathering afterwards. So if you want to stay for that, that will be happening. So I want to combine two questions from the Q&A. And this perhaps relates to a bit of the power dynamics that Alina was talking about. And someone asked, 1 second, let me bring it up. Is, in this power relations about talking about Palestine and Israel, how do we relate, or are we excluding the non-Abrahamic religions? So this is especially in North America and in Europe, for the context that you exist in. Are we excluding them, or how do they engage from your experience? Because it can seem quite Abrahamic-centered, the discussion concerning Israel and Palestine. And I'll combine that with another question that relates again to power dynamics, and that is, the question is whether Jews and Muslims should engage in dialogue about this conversation without Christians. So I'll let you decide how you answer those two questions. They kind of relate to each other in terms of power dynamics and faith backgrounds and identities. So I think we started with Ethan last time. So is it Jane now? Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Other faiths, yeah. I mean, our activities are open to people of all faiths, and we sometimes do facilitation training with people of no faith and other faiths. But we always say to people, you may not understand why people are getting so emotive about this. You know, if you come to this from a sense of identity and religious identity and identification with one group or another or other groups, then that's a different sort of relationship than if you're just looking at it as an academic study. So yes, by all means, but I think they need to understand that there's going to be maybe a qualitative, maybe a few question marks as what is going on here that they need to be prepared for. And secondly, can Jews and Muslims discuss this without Christians? Well, you know, what am I going to say? We found it really useful to have all three faiths, and whenever we do anything, there are three facilitators representing each tradition, so that all the participants know there's somebody who understands where they're coming from vaguely. But I think there are two reasons why Christians should be involved. First of all, this, as I said at the beginning, it's not a religious conflict. This is not something between Jews and Muslims. This is, and Alina's mentioned, you know, it's about people living in peace and security and without oppression and human rights and the right to have your own state and the right to live in peace in your own state. And it's all those things as well. And having Christians there and pointing out, look, you know, you might think all Palestinians are Muslims and all Israelis are Jews, but you're quite wrong. And, you know, I'm the example of this. But also you can have two faiths talking with the third there as a moderator. And I think that you know, and maybe even I fear you've got something to say about this, but I think when we've had three faith tours to the Holy Land, there's been a different element. I think sometimes as Christians we feel we've missed out a little bit, because sometimes we find ourselves in religious traditions, Christian traditions that don't seem to be very Christian as we know them, which is one of the things about the Holy Land. But of course you can have discussions, but I don't think they really solve the problems.
Thank you very much for that answer. Alina, how do you relate to this question of Jews, Muslim, perhaps they should have the dialogue, and how do we facilitate it with non-Abrahamic religions?
Yeah, I think, wait, if I got the first part of the question, it was also about how do we look at the situation, or like how do we deal with the situation in the Middle East? Or can you just repeat, because...
Sure, yeah. So in interfaith dialogue in perhaps Europe or North America, when Israel and Palestine do come up, how do people who don't belong to the Abrahamic faiths, how do we relate to them? How do we include them in the conversation, or do we exclude them? How does that work?
Sure, thank you. So I guess that actually depends on the premise or the angle that you take in addressing the situation, meaning something I've said before, you know, for me, and I believe for many with me, it's a matter of not something based on your religious identity, rather it's a matter based on human rights. It's a matter based on yeah, wanting to have peace. And I think the whole framing or wanting to emphasize or wanting to make it a religious conflict is again part of a Orientalist and Western framing that actually, you know, it goes into this idea of of somehow you know, the violent Muslim, the violent Arab that is never able to have peace in the region, rather than understanding situations in the region as more layers that are relating to Western imperialism, that are relating to colonialism, that are relating to like multiple histories that go, you know, years back. And so, okay, I feel I might be deviating from the question, but I think my point is to say that, you know, if for sure, if the premise is taking the angle that this is religious conflict, then I guess it only makes sense to have Abrahamic faiths there. But, you know, if your angle is a different one, and if what you're in fact doing is discussing Israel-Palestine, then actually I think, no, it should be whoever wants to be at the table. At the same time, talking about the question of importing the conflict, it's also not as if everyone should just or how do I say this? It's not as if we are all just how do I make my point? Not as if it's let's just all have a say and this is how we're going to solve it. Like it's like, again, it's more the framing or the platform should be more a platform of perhaps education, but also a platform of active working towards something, rather than let's all just have a say on what we think is happening here and how we should deal with this. And then with regards to the second question, well, as someone who has been doing Muslim-Jewish interfaith dialogue for multiple years, I do believe we can have dialogue without Christians. And also I do believe that for me, it's not about either or. I believe we should have dialogue, all of us together, and we should be able to have dialogue as Muslims and Jews specifically. That might be the same for dialogue between Jews and Christians specifically, which is something I cannot speak to, but why I believe there is an importance in Muslims and Jews specifically to have dialogue is, again, the importance of bypassing the idea that we are limited, our relations are limited to the past 73 years, and understanding that our history goes beyond, knowing and understanding that for the last centuries, big Jewish communities lived in Morocco. And in fact, this was actually one of the things that an organization I was part of in 2018, what we did is organizing a Muslim Jewish interfaith conference in Essaouira, Morocco. So Essaouira historically had a presence of 40% Jewish communities. And one of our intentions of actually organizing the conference there, an international conference, was highlighting and addressing, this history and this forgotten history, if I can say, and wanting to somehow reestablish, the ties that used to exist between Muslims and Jews. And on top of that, I think there is a, if I can say, relevance to Muslims and Jews coming together specifically, also because there is a specific history pre-Holocaust where both Muslims and Jews were othered and racialized in the same way. And like the shift that happened post-Holocaust, but so for that reason, there is something there that Muslims and Jews together can speak to, and which often is erased from the narratives and stories today. So yeah, I think there's great, and I mean, there's much more or many more points and reasons, but yeah, they're not coming to mind at this moment, but I think there is a lot to say for the importance of Muslims and Jews coming together without Christians. Not to say that it's only, but I believe in and, so this can be possible, and coming together, all of us, should be possible.
Thank you. And if I could pose it to our only North American, Ethan.
There is no one-size-fits-all dialogue. There is no one-size-fits-all partnership. I think the most important thing is that we be our authentic selves, that we make sure that there are authentic parties at the table, not just convenient parties. Being together, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, Baha'i, but we carefully select all the people who fit neatly into our echo chamber. That's a social event. That's not a dialogue from which we're going to learn very much, but having an opportunity for the people who are in a local community, and in Altoona, that's going to be different than in Amsterdam, and that's going to be different in Afula. And it's important that the people who are in a community be able to represent themselves. And I'll just say that in terms of whether or not the Christian community is participating, there are a lot of Muslim communities, there are a lot of Christian communities, there are a lot of Jewish communities. To think that there is somehow, My family came from the area that's now Belarus. My husband, who looks pretty similar to me, his mom was born in Baghdad, and we, our kids have that in their family tree. So my family chose to leave an area because of pogroms. His family was kicked out of an area because of anti-Semitism. That's part of our narratives, and the same thing in the Christian community, to be speaking with somebody, certainly in the US context, who's a mainline Protestant versus somebody who's an evangelical. And within mainline Protestants, there are many stripes, and among evangelicals, there are many stripes. And so there isn't a one-size-fits-all dialogue. There isn't a one-size-fits-all community. There's a lot that we can learn from one another if we try to understand others as they understand themselves in authenticity.
Thank you very much. So, Ophir, do you want to say a few words before we open it up to everyone?
Sure, but wish we could take more of the questions that are there in the Q&A, but maybe in a one-to-one in the social context you'll be able to. I'd like to close with the following thought. This week on Sunday, between the holidays of Eid al-Fitr and Shavuot, I picked up the phone, and during this violence, I spoke with both the chief rabbi and a leading imam in one of the Israeli cities, mixed cities, where there's been a lot of violence over the last week. And they both assured me that they were in touch, they continue to be in touch, they continue to meet and to bring others to their meetings, and that it was for times like this that they had been working and building their relationship for all these years. And I've heard them talk about their relationship for years, and now I saw it in the moment of truth to an extent. Each one emphasized that he felt optimistic about the future, and I would like to share with you their optimism, because I think that if two people like them at the eye of the storm can be optimistic at a time like this, that those of us on the outside, some of our panelists use the language of exporting and importing the conflict. I think that's one thing that we don't want to do any more of than we can possibly manage. So I expect that much of what we've heard today is challenging, but some of it is a source of hope for some of us. And I hope that knowing that there are those of us here, many of us here at the Rossing Center and the community at large, who are reaching across religious lines, even at this difficult time, and not even giving up on a webinar like tonight's at a difficult week as we are having.